Montana Territory, 1884. The train hissed to a stop beneath a sky the color of old tin, and as the door opened, Adelaide Orwood stepped down into a world that felt hollow with wind. Her boots crunched against the packed dirt of the tiny station outside Elk Bend, nothing more than a platform and a shed nailed together with rust and hope. She held her coat tight around her waist, a satchel over one shoulder, and a folded letter in her gloved hand, the one that had brought her here. "Mrs. Orwood?" A voice called, deep and rough, like gravel dragged across wood. She turned. The man waiting near a hitched wagon looked nothing like she imagined. Quinton Thorne was tall and broad in the shoulders, but half his face bore the angry memory of fire skin pulled tight and uneven, one eye narrowed by scar tissue. His left hand stayed gloved, even though the spring sun had begun to warm the air. He looked at her with a stillness that was not cold, but cautious. "I am," she said, her voice steady. "You must be Mr. Thorne." He nodded once, then stepped forward and took her satchel. "Wagons this way." Adelaide followed, her heart thudding harder than she meant it to. This was not the story she had read in his letters. But then again, she had not told the full truth either. He helped her up into the wagon with care, not touching her skin, not speaking for a long while as they rolled out past the edge of Elk Bend, toward the mountains, toward the land he called home. "Your place," she said after a while. "You wrote that it needed work." His jaw tightened. "Has not been plowed yet. Snow held longer this year. Ground's still wet underneath." She nodded. "I can help." He looked over, surprised. "You know how to farm?" "No," she admitted. "But I know how to work." That earned her a glance that lingered. Not pity, not doubt, just a man measuring truth. The land unfolded in wide, golden stretches of grass and scattered pine. When they reached the homestead, her breath caught. The house was small, wood-grayed, with a porch that leaned slightly. A barn stood to one side, and beyond it, the field unplowed, thick with last year's weeds. He helped her down. "It is not much, but it is mine." "I came for that," she said softly. "Not for comfort." He hesitated, then offered his hand. His gloved fingers brushed hers as she took it. Inside, the house was clean but quiet. She noticed the wide space between the table and the stove, the solitary chair beside the hearth. "Where's your family?" she asked. "Gone," he answered. "My wife died 6 years ago. Fire took the barn. Took her too." Adelaide's heart twisted. "I am sorry." Quinton nodded once, then turned to the stove. "I will make coffee. You can settle in." The first few days passed in silence and motion. Adelaide unpacked, washed linens, mended clothes left untouched in a trunk. Quinton worked outside fixing the barn roof, checking the plow, feeding the lone horse that remained. He never asked for help, but she gave it anyway. On the 6th morning, she brought him water while he was setting the fence line. "You are planting wheat?" she asked. "If the soil is not too wet, might try barley first." He wiped his brow with his sleeve and looked at her. "You regret coming?" "No, you look like you belong somewhere with gardens and music." "I came because I wanted something that would not change with the season," she said. "I came to build a life." Quinton studied her. "Even with a man like me?" She stepped closer. "Especially with a man like you." That night, as a cold wind moved in from the north, he brought in more firewood. She was at the hearth, stitching a torn hem. He stood behind her for a moment, then spoke. "My daughter would have been your age now." Adelaide looked up. "You had a daughter?" Her name was Hannah. She was 5 when the fire came. My wife tried to get her out. Neither made it. She reached for his hand. He did not pull away. "I lost my husband to fever," she said. "And my baby the winter after." He sank into the chair beside her, silence settling between them like a blanket. It was not love yet, but it was something that waited beneath the skin, quiet and steady. The next morning, she met him by the field. He held out a second pair of gloves. "If you still want to help," he said. She pulled them on. "Show me how." And he did. They worked side by side, days stretching into weeks as the thaw gave way to spring. The field turned under their effort, dark, rich soil rising from beneath the dead grass. He showed her how to guide the mule, how to lift the blade of the plow when it caught. She learned his rhythms, the way he hummed low under his breath when he worked, the way he nodded once when he was pleased. At night, they ate together. First, they just passed food. Then they spoke. Then they laughed. One evening, after supper, she stood at the door, watching the sun drop behind the hills. He came to stand beside her. "Would you have come if you had known what I looked like?" She turned to him. "I came for the man who wrote me letters with more honesty than I had ever known." "You have not disappointed me." He looked down, then back at her. "You are not what I expected. You are more." She smiled and he reached up, brushing her cheek with the back of his hand. "I want to build something with you," he said. "If you still want that too." "I do," she whispered. And just like that, under a sky streaked with orange and gold, he bent his head and kissed her. The field was unplowed when she arrived. Now it was ready for seed. And so were they. The seeds came by freight 2 weeks later, wrapped in burlap and smelling of dust and promise. Adelaide met the delivery cart at the edge of town, walking the mile back with the sack balanced across her shoulders, the ache in her arms a quiet satisfaction. Quinton was in the root cellar when she returned, taking inventory of what remained from winter. She set the sack down just outside, pressed her back against the wall, and waited until he noticed her. "You carried that alone?" he asked as he stepped into the light, brow lifting. "You were busy," she said. "And I wanted to." He studied her a moment, then nodded. "We'll start sewing in the morning." She followed him inside, noticing the faint smell of brass polish where he'd cleaned the door hinges earlier that week. The house had begun to shift under their shared hands, windows scrubbed, shelves organized, the porch righted with fresh nails. Nothing grand, but it no longer looked like a place waiting to be lived in. That night, after they finished their meal, she cleared the table while he sharpened the cedar blades. Neither spoke, but the silence had changed, no longer uncertain but companionable. "I need to ride into the basin next week," he said as she dried the tin plates. "The irrigation board's meeting. They want to talk about the new channel." She didn't look up. "Will you be gone long?" 3 days, maybe 4. Depends how much they argue." "Will you take the rifle?" Her voice was calm, but he heard what she didn't ask. "I will." She nodded once, set the plate aside, and reached for the next. He rose from the bench. "Before I go, I'd like to show you where the deed and the lockbox are kept." When she turned to face him, he was already reaching for the ledger tucked behind the mantel. He laid it on the table, opened it to the middle. "If something happens," he said, his voice even, "I want you to know where things stand. Nothing will happen." He looked at her, not arguing, just watching. "Still," he said, "you ought to know." She stepped beside him, reading the faded ink lines, the notations in his square, careful hand. Her fingers brushed the edge of the page where his had rested. "I won't let anything happen to this place," she said. "Not while you're gone." He didn't speak, but he closed the ledger and laid his hand over hers. The next morning they began planting. The rhythm settled into them quickly. She carried the seed pouches, dropping handfuls into the furrows he opened with the cedar. The mule pulled steady, its hooves sinking into the soft earth. Wind moved across the field in slow currents, lifting the dust, tangling her hair. By midday, her back ached and her palms had begun to blister beneath the gloves. Still, she didn't stop. Quinton handed her a dipper of water from the barrel and sat beside her beneath the lean shadow of the barn. "You don't slow down," he said. "You don't either," she replied. "I've known men who quit by noon just looking at work like this." She sipped, then passed the dipper back. "I didn't come to be idle." He looked out across the rows they'd finished. "You've done more than most would in a month." The sun caught in her hair, and for a moment he said nothing else. When they returned to the house that evening, she washed the dirt from her arms at the pump while he fed the mule. The sky behind them burned low and steady, not quite orange, not quite red. Inside, he took down a tin box from the shelf beside the hearth. "I found something," he said, opening the lid. "Didn't know if I should give it to you." She dried her hands and stepped closer. He pulled out a small book worn at the spine. It was my wife's. She kept recipes, notes, old scraps of things. Adelaide looked at the cover, faded blue cloth, a faint scent of lavender pressed into the pages. She would have liked you, he said. She believed in second chances. Adelaide touched the corner of the book. I don't want to take what was hers. She'd want you to have it. She held it carefully, as if it might break. Then I will keep it safe. He watched her for a long moment, then reached for her hand. I'll be back before the frost returns, he said softly. I'll be here when you are, she answered. That night, they sat close by the fire, her head resting against his shoulder, his fingers laced with hers. Outside, the field lay dark and quiet, cradling the seeds they had sown together. Inside, something deeper had taken root. The second morning after Quinton left, frost laced the fence rails in a thin, pale veil that burned off quick under the sun. Adelaide walked the length of the pasture with a small ledger tucked against her hip, counting fence posts, checking the line. A corner of the west field had begun to sag where the wire had loosened from the post. She made a note with a stub of charcoal, tied her shawl tighter, and moved on. By midday, she had repaired the hinge on the chicken coop and swept the porch clean of windblown grit. She didn't mind the quiet, there was always enough to do to fill the silence, but she caught herself pausing at the window more than once, watching the road that wound down from the ridge. That evening she climbed the ladder to the loft Quinton had never used and found an old oil lamp, dusty but whole. She cleaned the glass, trimmed the wick, and lit it. The warm glow filled the small room, casting shadows along rough beams and old trunks. She found a folded shawl that smelled faintly of cedar and tucked it over her knees as she sat down to write. Her letters were never sent. She only wrote to herself, a habit from the years after her husband's fever, when words had been the only place she could lay her grief. Now she wrote of the field, of the sound of wind through the dry stalks by the creek, of the way Quinton said her name like it lived heavy in his mouth, deliberate and whole. The next morning, she rose early and boiled water for bread. The dough took longer to rise in the chill, so she wrapped it in a towel and set it near the stove while she took the mule to graze along the lower meadow. The grass had begun to come in green and soft, and the mule nosed through it with slow satisfaction. Adelaide leaned on the fence, the sun warming her shoulders, and watched a hawk circle above the ridge. By afternoon, she'd finished mending the last of the winter bedding and carried it out to air. She paused in the doorway, arms full of quilts, when she saw a figure on horseback cresting the far hill. She didn't run, but her breath caught sharp at the sight. When Quinton rode into the yard, dust trailing behind him, she met him halfway. His coat was flecked with dry mud, the lines around his eyes deeper than when he'd left. "You're early," she said. "They argued less than I thought they would," he said, swinging down. "And I wanted to be back before the weather turned." She took the reins from his hand, brushed the sweat from the horse's neck. "You look like you haven't slept. I didn't want to stop overnight. Not after 3 days of listening to men who never put their hands in the soil." She led the horse to water, and he followed without speaking. When she returned, he was leaning against the porch post, watching her move like he was trying to memorize something. "Any trouble?" he asked. "Fence lines loose at the west corner. I marked it. Otherwise, no." He nodded, quiet. She stepped up onto the porch, close enough to see the dust still clinging to his collar. "You've been standing here for 5 minutes and haven't come inside. I didn't want to bring the trail in with me." She reached for his hand. "It's your house. Come home." He followed her in. She set water on to boil, and he lowered himself into the chair beside the hearth with a sigh that came from somewhere deep. "I brought something," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded paper and set it on the table. She opened it. A map creased along the folds, showing the new irrigation channel and the parcels it would run through. "They approved the plan?" she asked. "They did. If the spring runoff doesn't carry too much silt, we'll have water steady by June." She traced the ink lines with her finger. "That'll change things." He watched her hand. "So will this." She glanced up. His expression was steady, but something in it had softened. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the way you've taken to this place. About what we're building." She waited. "I don't want you to just live here," he said. "I want this to be yours too. Not just in paper or by deed, but in truth. Her throat went tight, but she kept her voice even. And how would we do that? He reached into the same pocket, pulled out a plain iron ring. Dull, worn smooth at the edges. It was my father's, he said. He wore it till the day he died. I kept it because I didn't want to forget what it looked like, something that lasted. She held out her hand. He slipped it on her finger, slow and certain. Outside, the wind stirred the new grass. Inside, she leaned into him, her forehead resting just beneath his jaw. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. The snowmelt came late that year, and by early May, the lower field shimmered with standing water that caught the light like glass. Quinton stood at the edge of it with his sleeves rolled up and one boot pressed into the soft bank. He didn't speak, just tracked the water line with his eyes, gauging how far it would retreat before the planting could continue. Adelaide brought him a strip of dried venison wrapped in cloth. You didn't eat this morning. He took it without looking away. Soil's too wet by half. I'll have to trench the north side. Let it drain out slow. She shaded her eyes against the sun. I could help lay the line. He tore off a piece and chewed before answering. I'll need to set the spade deep. Might hit stone. I can dig. He turned to face her then, the corner of his mouth lifting in something caught between approval and disbelief. You always answer like that. Like what? Like you've done it before. She shrugged. I had to teach myself most things. There wasn't anyone else to ask. He watched her for a moment, then handed her the rest of the venison. If you're set on helping, we'll start after supper. That evening they worked until the moon rose, its light turning the standing water pale and strange. She dug beside him, her boots sinking into the soft soil, her breath quick and even. He didn't speak much, only motioned where the trench should turn, where the grade should slope. She followed without question, matching his pace. When they finished, their hands were caked and raw, and the hem of her skirt was soaked to the knees. She leaned on the spade and looked back at the length of trench they'd carved together. I've never done that before, she said. You didn't stop, he replied. She looked at him then, the set of his shoulders, the way the light caught the edge of his jaw. Do you ever miss living in town? She asked. He shook his head. Too close. Too loud. I like being where I can hear my own thoughts. She wiped a streak of mud from her cheek with the heel of her hand. I used to walk half a mile just to hear nothing. Not even birds. Just the wind through the trees. You'll hear plenty of that out here. They started back toward the house, their boots leaving deep prints in the damp earth. Halfway to the porch, he stopped. I spoke to the man who handles the land records while I was in the basin, he said. She turned to him. I told him to start drawing up the papers. Put your name beside mine on the property. She stared at him, the words slow to settle. You already gave me the ring. I want more than a gesture, he said. If something happens to me, you won't have to answer to anyone. You'll have the right to decide what happens here. She stepped closer, the air still between them. You think that far ahead? I think about what I'd be leaving behind, he said. And who? She reached up, her fingers brushing his temple just above the old burn. Then I'll stay. For all of it. Not just the good days. He didn't answer, but he took her wrist gently and pressed her palm flat against his chest. Inside the house, they peeled off their damp clothes and warmed water over the stove. She sat behind him on the edge of the bed, wringing out a cloth, dabbing it gently across the raw skin of his shoulders where the sun had caught him. He didn't move, just let her tend him. You don't flinch, she said quietly. Not from you. She laid the cloth aside and wrapped her arms around him from behind, her cheek against his spine. Outside, the trench held steady under the moonlight. Inside, they lay down together for the first time, not rushed, not uncertain, just quiet, as though the whole house had slowed its breathing to match theirs. In the morning, the water in the field had begun to sink. By late May, the trench had drawn the last of the water from the lower field, and the barley rows had taken root in neat, furrowed lines, their green tips stretching skyward. Adelaide walked between them with a length of linen pinned beneath her hat to keep the sun from the back of her neck, a basket looped over her arm. She bent now and again to pull a weed by the root, shaking off the soil before moving on. Quinton was at the shed repairing the wheel hub on the wagon with a rasp and mallet. His shirt was stuck to his back and the brim of his hat cast sharp shadows across his face. When Adelaide reached the edge of the field and called to him, he looked up and wiped his hands on his trousers. "There's wild mint by the stream," she said. "I thought to cut some for drying." He stood, stretching his shoulders. "I'll walk with you." They crossed the grass toward the bend in the creek, where the water ran shallow and fast over smooth stones. The mint grew in thick patches along the bank, crushed leaves giving off a clean scent when she stepped among them. She knelt to cut the stems low, steady with her knife. Quinton crouched nearby, not cutting, just watching the way her fingers moved. "Did you always know you'd live this far from town?" she asked, not looking up. "I didn't know anything for certain after the fire," he said. "I stayed because I couldn't leave it empty." She tied a bundle of mint with a strip of twine. "And now I stay because there's something here worth staying for." She sat back on her heels, squinting up at him. "You ever think about what it would have been like if we'd met sooner?" "No," he said. "Sooner, I wasn't ready to be loved right." She didn't answer, but her gaze held his. He reached for the basket, now heavy with green. "We'll hang these in the cellar rafters." By late afternoon, they were back at the house. The scent of mint filled the air as they strung the bundles across the beams. Adelaide stood on a stool, tying the last one when Quinton stepped behind her and steadied her waist with both hands. "I've been thinking about what else this place could hold," he said. She looked down at him, the string held between her fingertips. "What do you mean?" "There's space beside the barn that catches the morning sun. If we built a small room there, it'd make a fine schoolhouse." She blinked, surprised. "You'd want children here?" "I would," he said. "If you would." She stepped down slowly, the string forgotten, her hands loose at her sides. I didn't think I could," he said. "But it's different now." They stood still, the cool air of the cellar thick with the smell of drying herbs. Then she reached for his hand. "I want that too." That night, they lay together with the windows open and the curtains stirring in the breeze. The moon laid a pale line across their quilt, and she ran her fingers along his ribs, tracing the place where the skin pulled tight from old burns. "You used to sleep with your jaw clenched," she said. "You don't anymore." "I used to wake up waiting for something to break," he said. "Now I wake up thinking about what we'll build next." She smiled into his shoulder and closed her eyes. The summer passed with steady work. They added a fence along the ridge to keep the deer out. Adelaide planted squash beside the house and learned to scrape the hides of rabbits for stitching. Quinton built a cradle from ashwood, not saying much while he worked, but letting her rest her hand on his when he paused. In early autumn, the barley came in golden and thick, and they harvested together, sweat rolling down their backs as they bent and tied bundles. The field that had once been raw and drowned now stood full and clean. They took the grain to Elk Bend with the wagon creaking under the weight. The miller offered a fair price, and Quinton wrote the amount in the ledger while Adelaide bartered for salt and lamp oil. On the way home, they passed a homestead with a sign out front, "Schoolmistress Wanted." She glanced at it once but didn't speak. He did. "You won't need to ride out for that." She looked at him. "We'll build it here," he said, "for whoever comes." They spent that winter making space. Quinton tore down the old lean-to and laid a new foundation from stone carried up from the creek. Adelaide stitched curtains for a future window and sorted through the old trunk in the loft for books. Snow fell quiet over the roof, but inside they moved with purpose, each day carrying the shape of something more. In the spring, the child came a boy with quiet eyes and his father's stillness. Adelaide held him close beneath a quilt she'd stitched with her own hands. Quinton sat beside the bed, one finger tucked into the baby's palm. They didn't speak, but their silence was full. Years passed. The schoolhouse took form beside the barn, its door painted blue. Children from neighboring homesteads came by foot and pony, and Adelaide taught them to read by the light of a wide window. Quinton farmed the southern acres now, the soil rich from years of care. Each evening, when the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long, they came together on the porch, their son between them, the warmth of their lives stretching out like the land they had claimed and kept not by force, but by the quiet persistence of love. And when they looked at each other, it was with the knowing that nothing had been easy, but everything had been worth it.